The gospel lesson for today is from the Gospel according to St. Mark, the 11th chapter, beginning at the first verse. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. And if anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it, and will send it back here immediately.'" They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside the street. And as they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, "What are you doing, untying the colt?" And they told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. And when they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it, and many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." And then Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Here ends the gospel. Today is the first time I wanted to talk about crowds today. Everybody has their own opinion of crowds. Some of us love crowds, some of us hate crowds. Somebody was asking me just recently how it was possible to live in a city like Chicago when, there were more retired people in my neighborhood than in the whole town of Holden. If you counted population. And do you know that if you took everybody in the world, every human person in the world, and gave them each 2 feet by 2 feet to stand on, and put them all next to each other, they'd fill up an area just a little larger than Jacksonville, Florida. See, we think these billions and billions of people take up a lot of land. They don't take up very much land, do they? Anyway, you have your own character, too, when you're in a crowd. Some of you are nervous in a crowd. I was in New York City for a preaching convocation, and there was a group there from the churches in Iowa, about 40 people in New York City, and they held on to each other, arm to arm, walking around like this, and looking at all the New Yorkers thinking, "Oh, is this a mugger?" When I was in the service, somebody said to me, "Well, everybody in Chicago carries a gun, don't they? Doesn't everybody carry a gun?" "Oh, yeah, yeah. We even give them to little kids starting about the age 3 or 4, as soon as they can hold a small one." Unbelievable. But you have your own character in crowds, and quite frankly, your character changes when you're in a crowd. When you mix with other people, you're not the same person simply as you are when you're alone. The crowds that we've experienced recently, of course, the first one was the presidential inauguration. My daughter, some of you had friends there too, my daughter and her boyfriend were there, and the crowd was full of positives. No incidents, no arrests, way over 1 million people gathered in one place. It was a very positive crowd. And then last week in the newspaper, there was this word about the World Cup qualifying match in Africa on the Ivory Coast. And as we've heard before, the crowd was pushing to get in, and a stampede was created, and 22 people died, and 132 people were wounded in this crowd. That's why some people are afraid of crowds. And then there's the crowds we've seen on the news with the economic summit in London, and the protesters, various kinds of protesters, large groups of people gathering to express their opinion about what's happening in the world economic crisis. Now, personally, I like protesters. I almost never saw a protest I didn't like, unless it was skinheads or something like that. But protesting is very much a part of democracy. And the great protesters are the ones that we refer to as the founding fathers and mothers of this country. But as I was watching that on CNN, I saw one guy who was a very interesting protester. Maybe you saw this guy. The guy with the green hard hat. Anybody see this guy? Well, there was a guy among the protesters with a green hard hat, and he was standing near the Bank of Scotland. The Bank of Scotland, I guess, is one of the largest financial institutions in the world and largely in big trouble, as many of our own institutions are in the present crisis. But this guy had a hard hat, and he took it in his hand and used it as a weapon because they were trying to break the windows of the Bank of Scotland. Big, tall windows, you know, up to the ceiling almost there. So he's banging on this window. Other people are picking up stuff. Finally, he breaks the window. Now the shards of glass have landed all over his wrist and his arm. He's all bleeding down here. So he decides he doesn't want to cut himself anymore. So he puts the hard hat on his head and runs into the window. His parents must be so proud. Can you imagine if you were the parent that put the little nipper through college and he's running into windows with a hard hat on because he doesn't want to cut up his arm? Of course, the fact that a large piece of glass could have taken his head right off never dawned on this genius kid. Crowds. You know, you have a crowd personality. And it could be very different for you if you were caught up in a certain kind of crowd. I've mentioned before some of the most awful stuff of crowd mentality, actually mob mentality, happened in the South in the years when blacks were lynched ordinarily for little reason, actually, in a racist town. And the people from First Baptist Church and probably First Congregational Church and First Presbyterian Church would gather on the common while the lynching was going on and have a picnic. That's a crowd mentality we can hardly understand. And then there's the crowd mentality that happened on that airplane on 9/11, when the passengers rose up and brought down that plane in Pennsylvania, that ultimate sacrifice. And they were part of a crowd that was not going to let the terrorists have their way. The important thing about crowds is that they can turn into communities. In the best sense of the word, a crowd can be a community. It can be a community with a powerful sense of good. All different people, different colors, different ethnic backgrounds sometimes, different levels of education, but a common cause. And also a positive value about life itself, where dignity is given to all people in that crowd. Everybody is a respected child of God. And individuals hold on to ideas of kindness and justice and the common good, even in the midst of the crowd. They can hold on to those values. Now, this was part of the Palm Sunday gospel story of Jesus riding through a crowd into Jerusalem. But Jesus' mission was to build that crowd, or some people in that crowd, whoever would hear him in that crowd, into God's loving community. I want to quote you something that was written by Wendell Berry. I know some of you have read him. He's really a spiritual author, much involved in environmentalism. But he's a Kentucky farmer and an author. He's written several books. He proposes that a community is a commonwealth of values. Although there's a lot of sentimental talk about communities these days, Berry observes that building and maintaining communities requires tremendous commitment. Community in a real sense is a commonwealth. He says it's a holding in common of many different things of value. It seems to me we belong to each other and to God. And if that's accepted, there are many practical things you are committed to do.